Welcome to another Listener into Lead podcasting tip, where I'll be sharing 30 tips on how coaches can begin to nurture listeners into leads while positioning themselves as a trusted authority with their very own podcast. Want to get leads and business from your podcast? You're in the right place. Hey, this is Anne-Marie and welcome to another Listener into Lead tip. And this is tip number 4. And in these couple of tips, I'm sharing the mistakes that I made 13 years ago when I started my very first co-hosted podcast back in 2008 and made a lot of mistakes. So I'm sharing some of the main mistakes that I've made so that you don't repeat those mistakes and can generate results far quicker from your podcast. Now, this particular tip follows on from tip number 3, which was comparing your podcast to mainstream radio and thinking that the audience you're creating is similar. But as you would have heard me share in tip number 3, it is not at all. Your podcast audience, especially if you are attracting a highly niched audience of your ideal clients, that audience, no matter the size, if they're highly engaged, far more engaged, they're more likely to take steps, to take action when you share a call to action as you're nurturing them along the customer journey. So far better than having a huge audience and they're not really doing anything. And if you've heard me share before in some of my masterclasses and even on my own podcast, I've shared I'd much rather have a highly niched, smaller audience of engaged listeners than having millions of downloads of people that are not really doing anything, especially as a coach who really wants to position themselves as a trusted authority while nurture listeners into leads. I've said that time and time again. So this now leads me to the next mistake that my co-host and I made, which was to assume that the best way to monetize our podcast was through advertising and sponsors. Now, don't get me wrong, sponsors are certainly one way that you can monetize your podcast, and it can work well for you if you've got the specific business model that is best suited to sponsorships. However, as a service-based business, so I'm assuming you are a coach, you have got a level of expertise that you have generated through, certifications that you've done, through years of experience. You know your stuff and you've got expertise to be able to help your ideal client overcome problems and challenges and so forth. So you are better off positioning your podcast to showcase your expertise, to create an audience of your ideal clients who you can then continue to build know, like, and trust with, and then begin to nurture those listeners into leads by getting them off your podcast and onto your list. I share more about that in my Profitable and Purposeful Podcasting Masterclass, about the exact step that I now use on my podcast and what I now teach all of my clients to set up in their podcast strategy. I'll share a link in the outro to this tip on how you can get access to the masterclass. So building a community of your ideal clients, continuing to build know, like, and trust, knowing the customer journey that your ideal client goes from just getting to know you through to, I cannot wait to work with you. What is the best program and package? You need to know all of that and then incorporate the steps that your ideal client goes through and leverage your podcast to be able to do that so that you can monetize your podcast by nurturing listeners into leads. You monetize your message before you monetize a sponsor's or an advertiser's. If you are a coach, if you've got a body of knowledge and expertise, if you want to leverage your podcast to generate clients, to build your reputation as a trusted authority in your industry, monetize your own message first, and then we can integrate a sponsorship monetization strategy on top of that. I'll see you in the next tip. Do you feel like the world's best kept secret and thinking about starting a podcast to build your visibility and reach? Or maybe you've started a podcast but you're just not generating the results you'd hope for. Go ahead and access my profitable and purposeful podcasting masterclass, where I'll show you how, with the right strategy in place, you can begin to nurture listeners into leads from your very first episode. Go to www.podcastingwithpurpose.com/listener into lead. That's podcastingwithpurpose.com/listener into lead.